Welcome to this programming tutorial. Today, we will be looking at array data structures. A data structure is a term used to describe how data might be arranged or stored. For example, we have already looked at variables. One very popular type of data structure is arrays. An array is a list of data. Think about arrays as a variable that stores multiple pieces of data in one. Let's look at how we can create an array. Just like with variables, we need to state the data type of the data stored in our array. Let's store strings for now. Next, I'll define the variable name. Let's call this a shopping list. Now let's assign the data we want to store in the list. In order to create the array data structure, we need to use curly brackets. This lets the program know that we are assigning a list of data to a variable. Before moving on, we need to modify one more thing. Let's change the data type from string to string array. In C#, we need to specify that this is a variable storing a list of string data, or an array of string data. To specify the data type as an array, add two square brackets next to the data type. These brackets will come back later in the lesson. Now let's add data inside of our curly brackets, using commas to separate the data values. This is our array. Our array currently stores 3 items: apples, oranges, and pears. One very important thing to note: you cannot increase or decrease the size of an array when it's created, as it is static. While you can change the data in the array, the size always stays the same. For example, if I were to change oranges to bananas or remove apples, the array would still remain 3 items long. Let's output our array. As you can see, we get a weird output. This is because, unlike variables, you have to specify exactly what value in the array you want to output. Remember the square brackets? We use the square brackets to define the index of the item we want. Let's add brackets to the end of our array name and write the number 1 to output apples, which is the first item in our array. Let's run our program. As you can see, we got oranges instead of apples, despite writing 1 in our square brackets. Here comes another important point about arrays. The indexes, or order of items in the array, starts at 0 and not 1. If we want to get the first item in the array, we need to start at 0. Let's see what happens. As you can see, we now have apples. Remember that because we start the index at 0, apples is 0, oranges is 1, and pears is 2. Let's do something a bit more complex now. I'll output the pears value, which is index 2. I will then change the data in index 2, i.e. the pears value, to bananas. Note that to change the array data, it's the same method as changing the variable, except you need to specify what index you are changing by using the square brackets. I'll then output the same index. As you can see, the program runs the instructions in sequential order. It outputs pears, changes the values to bananas, and then outputs bananas. Let's now output the 3 values. While this task isn't a difficult task for 3 items in the array, if you had to output 100 items, it would be a very long task. Can you think of anything we have learned previously that could help us here? If you guessed iteration, you'd be right. We can use count-controlled iteration or for loops to output all the values for us. Keep in mind that you could use a condition-controlled iteration, but in this case, with a list having a finite amount of items in it, it makes more sense to use a count-controlled iteration. Let's create a for loop. We start by declaring the counter variable that starts at index 0. In this example, I'll use I to specify that the counter is an index. Next, let's tell the iteration we want to repeat while I is less than the length of the array. You won't always be able to tell the length of an array, but C# has this handy .length method to help you get the length of something. In this case, it will run while I is less than 3, as there are 3 items in our array. Next, we will increment I by 1 every time the iteration repeats. Now, how can we output each item in the array? Remember that the square brackets indicate the index of the item we want to output. 0 is apples, 1 is oranges, and 2 is pears. Notice that in our for loop we have a value that automatically increases by 1 every time it repeats. So we can use the counter variable inside our square brackets, and every time it loops, it will move on to the next item in the array. Let's see the outputs. As you can see, we now have each element in our array outputted to the screen. One last thing to note. Sometimes you won't know what needs to go inside of an array. In that case, it might be difficult to create an array that needs to have a specific size. To solve this, you can create an array with empty slots in it. To create an empty array, start by writing the array data structure you normally would, but in this case, I will create an integer array. Keep in mind that you need the square brackets in front of the data type. Then we assign a new integer array and specify the size of it in square brackets. This tells the program that we want to create an array that is 100 in size. Keep in mind each of the indexes will be empty. If you want to add something into the array, you just write the array name with the index. Let's fill slot 27 in the array we created. And then we will assign it a value. Easy as that. In our next lesson, we will look at a more complex version of arrays. Thank you for watching this tutorial. I hope you have found it helpful.